Hey everyone, welcome to the very first of these design diaries on this board game. And the topic I wanted to start out with is something that's pretty fundamental to a game about higher education, which is the school or institution that you're talking about. So in the game, there's jobs you can get, and the jobs are at different schools. And one of the things I wanted to try to model and use from the educational side and from the sort of strategic gameplay side is that there's different types of institutions you might be at, and what your faculty job at each of those would be could be pretty different. So you could be at a really high powered research institution and maybe you're expected to be publishing a ton, but you don't have a lot of teaching load. Maybe you have grad students doing a lot of the grading and teaching for you. Or you might be, at the other extreme at like a community college where you're not doing any research or publication in most cases, but you're teaching a lot and you're working directly with the students, and that's where the bulk of your time is going. In the very first iteration of the game, I had a ton of different ways I was trying to categorize schools and make different types of institutions. So I had a ranking for the prestige of this school, and then I had whether the school is a public or a private institution, because that can make a difference for kind of funding. And are you dependent on your state government or on endowments, and what kind of students are you getting? Is it a more selective school or a less selective school? Meaning, like, of the students who apply, do most of them get in or most of them get rejected? I was doing research classification. So if you're not familiar with this nomenclature, there's something called the Carnegie classification for basically how much research spending is going on at your school, how many PhDs you're granting. There's a lot of detail to it, but that's kind of the nuts and bolts. And there's like what's called an R1, which is the highest, most research, most PhDs being done, and then an R2, which is less, and an R3, which is less. And then there's things that aren't research institutions. So you could have a teaching institution like a liberal arts type school. And then you also have like your community colleges, 2-year schools. So I had all of those. I had location, is it a rural or an urban area, and what part of the country is it in? Is it a big school or a small school? So all these different things going on. All of them in some way affected something in the game, but most of them were pretty minor in terms of their impact. And it seemed like a lot of complication, a lot of things to keep track of that weren't really doing much for the gameplay or the educational aspect of it. So I ended up simplifying it down. And so what I have right now is the institutions are categorized pretty simply. There's a prestige ranking, and this basically factors into how big of a personal achievement is it if you get a job at this school, or how does it help your reputation. Then there's also a classification of type, but I streamlined this down to 3 categories. So there's 2 types of 4-year schools. Either it's a research-focused 4-year school where there's a lot of emphasis on publications, a teaching-focused 4-year school where you're primarily focused on teaching, although there'd be some publication requirements as well, and then a 2-year community college-style school. I thought about also including a 4th category of for-profit institutions, which are part of the educational landscape nowadays, but that seemed to add a level of complexity because it's a very different type of job and type of institution where a lot of the other things wouldn't apply, so I left those out. And then besides those 2 things, which are sort of about like what type of institution it is, I only kept 2 other categories. So one is the location, which I kept pretty simple. I just used the US Census regions and put it in one of 4 regions of the country. So it's either in the Northeast, the South, the West, or the Midwest. And the reason for this was I do think it's an important aspect from the educational standpoint, this idea that in academia you don't necessarily have a lot of say of where you end up. So you might want to find a job, close to your family or in a particular region of the country, and there may just not be jobs there at the time that you're looking. So I wanted to keep some element of that, but keep it pretty simple. So I ditched the stuff about a small or large school and about whether it's urban or rural, and just have these sort of regions, and there's some bonuses or penalties depending on what character you are and what region you end up in and whether you have to move, because that takes time and stress as well. And then the last category that's in there right now is I kept this public-private distinction. There's still some other things that interacts with in the game that I like. I'm kind of debating whether the benefit of those is worth the complication of having one more attribute, but that's in there right now. So that's where I'm at with the schools right now. Got it simplified down to those 4 elements. Maybe it'll be going down to 3 if you have thoughts on whether I should be keeping public or private, if that's important or not. Or maybe if you think some of those other things were important and should be keeping those, would love to hear it. But right now I've got it simplified down to those. So anytime you're applying for a job, you'll find out that information about the school, so you know what type of institution it is and kind of what the expectations would be there and where it is and if it's public or private. That's our first design diary about schools, and hope that was interesting. I'll see you next time.